Hello, BookTube. We're continuing with our read-along of the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant by Stephen R. Donaldson. Me and a group of other booktubers are doing read-alongs of each book from July until December of this year. So that's the first 6 books of Thomas Covenant. We're not going to consider the final trilogy. So we're doing one book a month. And we started last month with Lord Foulsbane, the first book in the first Chronicles of Thomas Covenant the Unbeliever. And we're continuing today with the Illearth War, the second book. And my colleagues are going to be doing one video on the third week of every month. But I have received special dispensation to do just a normal read-along. In this case, we're reading roughly 8 chapters a week of the Illearth War. So today we're reading from the first chapter, The Dreams of Men, all the way to the chapter Lord Kevin's Lament. And just do a normal read-along of them. And Donaldson starts this book by catching the reader up to speed on some of the key things that happened in Lord Foulsbane. I thought I would do the same thing, just in case you're somehow coming to this without having watched that. I'll just, in brief, Lord Foulsbane starts with, in our world, in the normal world, with a writer named Thomas Covenant, whose book has been a bestseller. He has a wife, he has a young son, they live on a farm outside of town. And he's at work on his second book when he contracts leprosy. And his wife leaves him and takes their son, and he goes to a leprosarium where the doctors inform him that with medication and self-care, he can arrest his disease and live a relatively normal life, despite the fact that his peripheral nervous system is largely gone. He has no feeling in his hands and feet. He's impotent. He can largely stop that from getting worse as long as he acknowledges that any bump or scrape or cut could be deadly. He has to put his own leprosy foremost in his mind at all times, and then he will live. And he goes back home, but word has spread to town that there's a leper who lives in the farmhouse outside of town, and they don't want anything to do with him. They especially don't want him coming into town, so they start paying his bills for him, buying his groceries, and sending him out to his doorstep. And eventually he decides in the beginning of Lord Foulsbane that treatment, that unpersoning, will drive him crazy if he lets it continue. So he goes into town to pay a bill. And when he's in town, he is almost hit by a car and loses consciousness. And when he wakes up, he is in a mystic land, a place called the Land, having been summoned there by a being called Drool, using a mystical implement called the Staff of Law. But he is saved from Drool by another mystic being called Lord Foul, an age-old enemy of the Land, who does not like the fact that Drool has the Staff of Law. The Staff of Law is a danger, both to the inhabitants of the land and to the sorcerous lords who lead the land, but also to Lord Foul himself. He entrusts Covenant with a message to bring to the lords in Revelstone, warning them that Drool has the Staff of Law and telling them to take it from him, because Foul can't do that himself. And when Covenant awakens from that warning, he's at the high precipice of stone. He has a terrible fear of heights. And a young girl named Lena helps him down the long staircase from that pinnacle. And he's cut and scraped on the way down, and naturally that worries him. But it turns out the land is a place of preternatural health. And Lena helps his wounds with a thing called hurt loam, a kind of mystic mud that heals wounds quickly and immediately. And she applies that to his cuts and scrapes, and unbeknownst to him, and at first unbeknownst to us, the reader, it also starts to work on his leprosy. The land turns out to be a place where even lepers can be healed. But Covenant doesn't realize that at first, and the young girl Lena takes him to her village, introduces him to her father, Trell, who is a stone worker, but not with tools, with a kind of hedgerow mysticism of the land. There are certain people who are skilled in working stone with their hands, just like there are certain people who are skilled with working wood through magic rather than carving or whatever. She also introduces him to her mother, Auntie Aaron, who's held in high esteem in the village, but who once studied at Revelstone with the lords until she sort of washed out. The lore of the lords exceeded her ability to master it, so she came back home. And Covenant spends some time in the village, and he's constantly ranting to Lena and anybody else who will listen that this is all a dream, and that since it's a dream that's urging him to be healthy, it's a deadly dream for a leper to have. Lepers must remember that they are not healthy. And at one point, in the midst of all that self-pity and recrimination, as Covenant is sort of getting his mojo back, inexplicably, he rapes Lena. And she doesn't tell anyone at first. She especially doesn't tell her mother, who volunteers to help lead Covenant to Revelstone. And they're on the road to Revelstone when suddenly a villager who does find out the truth from Lena attacks Covenant with a knife. And that is at that moment that Covenant realizes that his sense of touch has returned to his fingers and feet, to his hands and feet. And it's at that moment that Atiaran learns why this villager, this colleague friend of hers, has become deadly, when all the people of the land have taken an oath of peace, never to commit violence. And her oath of peace is so strong that even once she learns that about Covenant, she still agrees to take him to Revelstone, even though she now loathes him for what he did to her daughter. And they're making their way, and Atiaran is exceeding the limits of her strength when once again they are saved. They encounter a giant. There's a race of giants in the far east of the land. Seafaring beings who come from across the ocean and have made a colony in the far east of the land. And they're twice as tall as humans, twice as powerful. And they meet a giant called Saltheart Foamfollower, who has a craft on the river. Atiaran charges him with taking Covenant the rest of the way to Revelstone. And Foamfollower does. And we get to Revelstone, and we meet the lords, these sorceress beings, each of whom has a staff that channels their power. We also meet the Blood Guard, a group of ageless, sleepless men who guard the lords and have sworn a vow, very different from the Oath of Peace, to do that, to protect the lords at all costs, and summoned the mystic power of the land to bind them to that oath in such a way that they are without sleep, they do not age, they are thousands of years old. And they are remnants of a time thousands of years ago when a High Lord named Kevin, confronting Lord Fowl, decided that the only thing he could do to beat Lord Fowl would be to destroy the land itself, and hope that that destruction also included Lord Fowl. He takes precautions, Kevin does, against that. He breaks up his mystical knowledge into wards of power and scatters them. He gives the first ward, for instance, to the giants and orders them to go back to their home at the far reaches of the east. He sends the Blood Guard away into the mountains, deceives them, and sends them away because he knows if he doesn't do that, their loyalty will force them to die with him. And he hides the rest of his wards so that they can only be unlocked bit by bit and only when the unlocker is ready. So they're to be found and unlocked in sequence once the land survives. Then he invokes something called the Ritual Desecration, which destroys the land but does not destroy Lord Fowl. And now, all these years later, Lord Fowl has given Covenant a message telling the lords, I am back, and also charging them with the mission of finding a character named Drool, the character in Lord Fowl's Bane, who originally summons Thomas Covenant to the land. He summons Thomas Covenant using a mystical artifact called the Staff of Law. But Drool doesn't know how to use the Staff of Law. He's groping at that. Lord Fowl helps him to summon Covenant, mainly because Lord Fowl is both covetous of and afraid of the white gold wedding ring that Thomas Covenant wears still out of sentimentality, even though his wife has left him. There is no white gold in the land. And in the land, white gold is a source of wild magic that can threaten Lord Fowl. Lord Fowl helps Drool to summon Thomas Covenant to the land, but Lord Fowl really wants the lords to get the staff away from Drool. He knows the oaths of peace that the lords have sworn. He would rather have them have this influence that can be a danger to him than have something like Drool have it. And in Lord Fowl's Bane, the lords do set out on a quest to take the Staff of Law from Drool, and they succeed. And in the meantime, they also uncover another of Kevin's wards of power. And that is how Lord Fowl's Bane ends. It ends with the lords in possession of the Staff of Law and in possession of another ward, the second ward of High Lord Kevin's lore. But it ends in another way as well, because the version of the Ritual of Desecration that the lords call down upon the land in order to escape from Drool kills Drool. And when that happens, Covenant is immediately sent back to the real world. We learn, in other words, two things at the end of Lord Fowl's Bane. One is that the summoned person, in this case Lord Thomas Covenant, the spell that summons him is broken if the summoner dies. And the second thing we learn when Covenant learns it in the hospital when he wakes up in the real world at the end of Lord Fowl's Bane, which is that only 4 hours have passed. in our world. The Doctors tell him that. And that is going to play a major role in all the later Covenant books. If you're paying attention at the end of that book, you realize time passes much more swiftly in the land than it does in our world. And that ended Lord Foulsbane, and at the beginning of the Illearth War, we are back in our world. Back with grousy, self-pitying, I am a leper, don't you understand my pain, Thomas Covenant, who is wandering around his farm, decides that he will once again strike out into the real world that does not want him, goes hitchhiking on the road. He's picked up by a trucker who immediately starts to talk about that leper fella, Thomas Covenant. Doesn't seem to recognize Covenant, doesn't seem to recognize Covenant has only two hands on one, that is, two hands missing on one finger, or one hand. That you'd think would be a physical sign that everybody would talk about as a way to know whether or not you're dealing with the town leper. But one way or another, they go to a club, and there's an arresting moment where Covenant thinks that a singer at the club has called him by a name from the land. But the evening is interrupted by the local sheriff, who has heard stories from drivers in his little fiefdom that the leper Thomas Covenant is out hitchhiking and wants Covenant to know that's unacceptable. Drops him off, takes him out of the nightclub, drops him off on the road. Covenant finds his way back home, and two things happen in rapid succession. He gets a phone call from his wife, who's decided after all this time to call him, and this is an old landline phone, and he tangles his feet in the phone line, falls over, and hits his forehead on the coffee table. And right at the moment when those things are happening, he is summoned to the land again. Summoned to Revelstone. And at first, he's bleeding from his forehead, and he's yelling at these people, at the lords who've summoned him, to send him back. My wife is on the phone. She's called after all this time. She'll never forgive me if I don't talk to her. But eventually, he is drawn into the story of the land. And one of the first things he realizes is that 40 years have passed. A few weeks have passed in his own life, but 40 years have passed in the land. And most of the characters that he knew are either dead or older. Now, they're not as old as they should be. Like, for instance, Lord Moram, one of the main characters in Lord Foulsbane, is 40 years older, but he doesn't look it. It turns out that service to the land, either that stoneworking and woodworking lower-level magic or the higher-level magic that the lords at Revelstone use, prolongs your life. And giants live a lot longer than humans do, and in Bloodguard don't age at all. So the shock is not as bad as it would be. The plot lines from Lord Foulsbane are still very much active, even though 40 years have passed. Most of the same characters are still around. And Covenant meets a lot of them. He meets Banner, the Bloodguard that guarded him during Lord Foulsbane. He doesn't meet Saltheart Foamfaller in the chapters that we're reading today, but he meets all the other lords, most of whom are new to him. He meets the person who is High Lord, the leader of the lords. It turns out it's not Lord Moram. It's a young woman named Yelena, who has an odd vibe with Covenant right away, and we find out in these chapters why that is. And there's also, in these chapters, we are reintroduced to all the stuff that was in Lord Foulsbane. We are brought up to speed with the plot of that original book, and we are brought up to speed with what the lords have been doing in those intervening 40 years. They have been building on the lore that they learned. They've been studying the second ward of Kevin's lore. They've been building up the war ward, their armed services, their horses, their soldiers. They've been spreading word throughout the land that Lord Foul is back and that people need to be building their awareness. They haven't been idle. But they are still, as Lord Moram says, weak. That something is wrong. They're not understanding. They're not unlocking the mystic power of Kevin's wards in the way that Moram thinks they should be. Staff of Law they have, and it's very powerful. And Elena wields it with a strong hand, but they aren't ready for Lord Foul if he's going to make war on the land. And that is interesting. Right away in this book, when you start to read it, you start to come across things that are interestingly different from the very, very Lord of the Rings-esque template of Lord Foulsbane. In Lord Foulsbane, it's almost impossible. Once you get over the shock of the hero being a leper from our world, the land seems very much like Middle-earth and has lots and lots and lots of parallels to Middle-earth, from Ranihin and Rohirrim to giants that are like Ents to a single evil, amorphous, dark being who used to be in league with the other lords, to a one ring that has deadly power that even that Lord Foul fears, to a whole bunch of other stuff. Whole bunch of stuff of parallels that generously we can call them homages. Generously we can say that Donaldson really loved Lord of the Rings. Who doesn't? and that he just wanted to echo some of that stuff. But in Lord Foulsbane, it's hard to read. It's hard to look around in that book for innovations that don't owe anything to Tolkien. Like, for instance, the giants would be, except that Tolkien goes out of his way to make them like ants, in the fact that they find ordinary, everyday speech to be far too hasty, and they would like to take 2 hours just to say hello or whatever nonsense like that. If the Ranihin, these magnificent horses, are a lot like the Miras, of whom Shadowfax is a member. The Ramen, who live on the plains of Ra in the land, are a lot like the Rohirrim, except they don't ride horses. They don't ride the Ranihin. They just tend to them. There are little bits and pieces of originality in Lord Foulsbane. The Bloodguard, for instance, have no parallel in Tolkien. But not many. You come out of Lord Foulsbane really thinking that you've read The Fellowship of the Ring. There's a quest, there's a ring, there's whatnot. It's in the Illearth War that you start to encounter more originality, more inventiveness, and I like that very much. I want to stress that about this book. And we start to encounter that right away when Covenant starts to learn more and more about the land. And one of the strangest things that he encounters in the 80 pages that we're reading today is a character named Hyle Troy, who wears a breastplate. He's a warlord. He's the leader of the Lord's military wing. Their soldiers, their commanders, their horses. He's their military leader. But the thing that strikes Covenant about him is that he has wraparound sunglasses on, which you don't find in an agrarian, an idyllic place like the land. And the reason for it turns out to be that Hyle Troy is also from our world. He was born blind. He's born without eyes. He's a master strategist and tactician who was being used by the U.S. military for plotting and troop deployment and whatnot. When there was a fire in his building, and he can feel it, he can't see it, he can hear it coming for him, and eventually he gets out the window and is hanging from the window, feeling the flames licking at his knuckles when he is summoned to the land. At first, Covenant is told that he is summoned by a student of the Lord's who uses the summoning spell incorrectly and dies as a result of it. So Troy is summoned to the land and then marooned there because his summoner dies in the act. So the way for Troy to go back home would be if his summoner dies, but his summoner's already dead. So that there's a little loophole there. Covenant himself is summoned by High Lord Elena using the Staff of Law, just like Druil Rockworm used the Staff of Law to summon him in the first book. But Hyle Troy tells this story about how Hurtloam was applied to his eyes. Of course, the people in the land don't have blindness. And it started to cure him. Not to regrow eyes, not to change his ocular sockets, but to sort of give him a kind of extrasensory sight that is focused on his forehead. So he wears the wraparound sunglasses just so his eyes don't distract people, but he is able to see. He's able to walk and perceive the sunlight, perceive the sun, perceive colors, details, everything. In fact, his sight in full sunlight is much better than a normal person's. But that's not why the lords have grappled them to him. They've grappled them to him because he displayed tactical and military genius, and they feel they're going to need that against Lord Foul because Lord Foul's forces are building in the east of the land. He is amassing a huge conventional army. At one point in the 40 years that have passed, an incident that we don't see, Lord Moram goes to the edge of that stronghold of Lord Foul in order to find out the extent of it, and is caught in combat with one of Lord Foul's three greatest servants, the Ravers, disembodied spirits who take over bodies. They take over. Each one of them takes over a body in order to conduct Lord Foul's will through it. Again, an echo of the ring wraiths from Lord of the Rings. There are only three wraiths, and it's literal possession. They don't have husk bodies that they just operate under. They possess someone in order to do what they do. And the Ravers, Lord Moram learns, are abroad, are in strength, are now as strong as they've ever been, and are once again assembled and the servants of Lord Foul. Covenant learns all of this in the 80 pages that we're reading today. And he learns one other thing that distresses him in a way more than anything else, which is that for years now the giants in their eastern home of Sea Reach have not been heard from. Naturally, the lords suspect the worst. Naturally, they suspect that some evil has befallen the giants, including Saltheart Foamfaller. So at the end of the chapters that we're reading today, they organize a quest to go east to the giants and find out what's going on. 2 lords will go, a complement of Bloodguard, some Ranihin, and one of the lords, Lord Hiram, son of Hool, a fat, jolly man who is a template that Donaldson loves to use. You're never far from such a template in any of his fantasy novels. Lord Hiram actually goes to Covenant in secret and asks him if he would go along. That is against the wishes of High Lord Elena, as the lords point out. Since we don't know how strong Lord Fowl's forces are in the east, it would be the height of folly to send the white gold into their midst. And Covenant refuses to go anyway. High Lord Elena is angry with Lord Hool for Lord Hiram for even suggesting it, but Covenant refuses anyway. He doesn't know how to use the ring. He would be useless to them. So they go off without him. The end of the chapters that we're reading today is that quest heading off. Under the safeguard of a Bloodguard named Korig. He is to bring the lords to Sea Reach, the home of the giants, and his mission is first to do that, and second to protect the lords. So the Bloodguard have been giving strict instructions that they must not die in defense of these lords. That's a very big thing that will turn out later on to be important in the book. And the other shocker that Covenant learns in the course of these chapters that we're reading today is that it wasn't a student who summoned Heil Troy to the land and died in the process. It was Artiaran, Lena's mother, who, out of bitterness and feeling utterly surpassed by her grief and outrage of the events in the first book, returns to Revelstone to resume her studies, and is still surpassed by the lore that she's studying. She handles it poorly and dies. It was Artiaran who died to bring Covenant to the land, or to bring Heil Troy to the land. It wasn't a student. It was someone Covenant knows. And the other strong thing that we learn is that Elena is Lena's daughter. It's the piecemeal revelation of that fact happens throughout this book. Well, we'll be talking about High Lord Elena and Thomas Covenant quite a bit in the course of this book. Quite a bit. There's a lot to deal with on that front of the story. But for right now, that's where we end things. For these eight chapters, is that Covenant has been summoned to the land once more. He has been healed from the forehead wound that he gave himself in our world, and he's once again at the center of the deliberations of the Lord. They summoned him because even though he has told them over and over again, I don't know how to use the white gold, and I don't believe that any of this is real, they still think that when it comes to it, he will save them somehow. No idea how that will happen. They don't know. They're finding all sorts of implements that can help them. They find a mystic knife called a krill, the krill of Lorik. And when Covenant touches his white gold ring to the krill, it glows like a sun. The gem that's embedded in his hilt starts to glow. It's obvious these things are connected, but nobody knows how. And that's where we end things today. We end things with Covenant back in the land 40 years later. A mission has gone out to Sea Reach to find the giants and find out what's wrong with them. And Heil Troy has strong thoughts about how to defeat Lord Fowl militarily. Not using sorcery, just how to defeat his conventional forces using Troy's conventional forces by studying the topography of the land itself. We don't get anything like that in Lord of the Rings, and some of those aspects get more and more individualistic and interesting as this book goes on. So, this is the point where I always want to know what you make of all this. Like, for instance, if you're reading this for the first time, did you see the time differential coming? 40 years between 2 installments of a story. That's pretty daring. And also, those of you who stuck around for Lord Fowl's Bane, do you think you're going to be able to do it? Do you think that you're going to be able to overlook what Covenant did to Lena in the first book? To stick around with him as a main character. I think Donaldson probably, on some level, understands how untenable that is on so many levels, and so he splits the narrative focus in this book quite a bit. There's quite a bit of narrative focus that's split away. He gives us another character from our world, for instance, to divert our attention. A main character. Heil Troy is going to be a main character in this book. And he also gives us lots and lots and lots of operatic, big-scale action to pay attention to, so that we're not constantly stuck remembering that one of our main characters is a rapist, and a fairly unapologetic one, too. I'm interested to know what you're making of all of that. I myself think that these first 8 chapters of the Illearth War show far greater storytelling ability, far greater confidence, far greater imagination than anything in Lord Foulsbane. Even the beginning of this book is so much better than anything in the whole of that previous book. But you tell me, maybe you don't think that's true. I want to hear all about it. I want to hear your reactions to this as we go on. So we're going to read the next. Let's see. We're stopping in chapter 8. So next week we will read from the chapter Glimmermere all the way to the chapter Tull's Tale, which is chapter 17. It's 2/3 of the way through part 2. And Tull's Tale is an amazing chapter on its own, just on its own as a narrative construct. It is amazing. It's amazing. So we have some really great stuff coming up. I want to promise you that in case Lord Foulsbane quite understandably left a bad taste in your mouth. We have some great stuff coming up in here, some high points of modern epic fantasy. I want to assure you of that. And Tull's Tale is one of those high points. There are a few of them in this book, but we'll get to them. So I'm going to wrap this up for now, but we'll reconvene next week for the next 8 chapters of the Illearth War. So tell me all about what you thought of the first 8 chapters, and I'll see you then. Thank you, BookTube.